I have two guests. Again, my in-house panel of bank regulators, Bill Isaac, who was the head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which Sheila Bair heads now. He was there from 1981 to 1985. He is now chairman of Fifth Third Bancorp and author of a book, Senseless Panic, How Washington Failed America. Also, Harvey Pitt, who is currently CEO of Kalorama Partners, but he was the chairman of the SEC. In other words, that's Mary Shapiro's job now, from 2001 to 2003. And Harvey, you were making the point that one of the reasons you were so vehemently critical of Dodd-Frank overhaul is that the SEC won't have the tools to do the job it needs to do. What do you mean by that?
Well, very simply this. I think the bill foists on the SEC jurisdiction over the derivatives and swaps markets insofar as they're securities related, and gives the non-securities related aspects to the CFTC. The SEC is not only going to have to master a whole new marketplace, but it's then going to have to enforce whatever rules it puts in place. And this is being done, in effect, under the artificial time constraint of having everything in place by September of this year. It's an impossible task in the best of situations, but it becomes even more impossible when you realize that the SEC doesn't have the expertise to deal with the derivatives markets. The CFTC not only doesn't have the expertise, but it's only got about 600 employees, and we're talking about a marketplace that is $600 trillion. It dwarfs all of the existing markets in equities, debt, and commodities futures and other financial futures that presently exist. And there's been no infrastructure the way there has been for 75, 80 years with respect to securities and commodity futures. That's one problem. The SEC is going to have to regulate hedge funds now. The SEC doesn't have the staff at present to do examinations and inspections that are required of the entities it already has under regulation. It's going to get another 8,000 hedge funds. It has to take on more responsibility with respect to credit rating agencies. And here I'm not questioning whether there's a need for more oversight of credit rating agencies. I'm just saying if you want somebody to do the job, you have to give them the tools.
Well, Harvey, can I break in? Because what drives me nuts is that the SEC could hire, if you just let the SEC keep the fees it raises, they could have way more people on staff, way more technology, way more infrastructure. But Congress treats this like they're doling money out to the SEC so sparingly when it's investor protection, all these aspects, banking, all is so important.
You're right, and there's a very simple reason that people ought to understand. The appropriations committees in the House and Senate do not want to give up the SEC because since the SEC falls within their budgetary jurisdiction, all of the people who are regulated by the SEC will presumably make campaign contributions to the members of the Appropriations Committee. That is, as far as I can tell, the only reason that the SEC is not given the ability to be self-funding. Many of the financial regulators have it. Neither the SEC nor the CFTC have that ability.
Bill, let's get you in here because to a certain extent, this isn't regulatory capture. This is politician capture, and we're well aware of how that works in Washington. But particularly with this question of derivatives and swaps, you know what, the five big banks have controlled 90% of that market. It's hugely profitable, and they are fighting very hard to keep as much of that market, as much of that business as they can on their plate, right? And only dole out the smallest part to these exchanges. How is that going to play out?
Kathleen, before I go there, let me just say that I agree with everything I just heard Harvey say. This is an impossible job that the SEC's been given. They don't have the funding for it. They don't have the people for it, and it's just a disaster in the making, because the markets are beginning to, would naturally assume that all of these different players are now being regulated, and people will hopefully, probably relax, hoping that everything's being taken care of by the government, and it won't be. The SEC cannot do this job with its current funding and its current staffing. I think the Congress made just a terrible mistake by not focusing more on the SEC and what it takes to reorganize and re-energize and define a new mission for the SEC. They just punted on that issue in Dodd-Frank, and I think that's another signal failing of that bill. As far as the derivatives markets, and I would agree with you that the largest banks are the big power players, and they are going to be in control of that market, and they're not going to. Not going to welcome a lot of competition. I would note something that I saw in the on this very subject in the Wall Street Journal this morning. They had an opinion, and let me just quote from it, because I think it's a very important, particularly to hear this coming from the Wall Street Journal opinion page. As we've argued before, the way to limit the power of big banks is to break them up or take away their subsidies, not to engineer flaws into trading platforms that are ultimately backed by the taxpayers. And that's a very powerful sentence,
sure is.
And something that I think that we need to focus a lot of attention on. And while we're on, our subject this morning is Dodd-Frank, and I would just note that another thing that Dodd-Frank did not even consider, they punted on this issue, is whether we need to bring back the restrictions of Glass-Steagall, which separated commercial banking and investment banking back in the Depression. They broke up these firms and wouldn't let them compete in each other's lines of business. That bill, that law, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in 1999. I actually favored it when it was repealed. I favored repealing it, but it hasn't worked, and we really need to have a debate in this country, and Dodd-Frank didn't do it, on whether we should bring back the Glass-Steagall restrictions that existed in 1999, and I think we should.
We're going to continue our conversation with Harvey Pitt. He's a former chairman of the SEC. Bill Isaac just speaking, former head of the FDIC. Bill says let's bring back Glass-Steagall. We'll find out what Harvey thinks and what else really needs to be done to put the financial system in the United States on a sound track. That's next on Bloomberg Radio. Bill Isaac, former head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. He is currently chairman of Fifth Third Bancorp and author of the book Senseless Panic, How Washington Failed America. Great book about what happened in the financial crisis, how we got TARP, and more. Harvey Pitt, CEO of Colorama Partners. He was the chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC. And as the head of the FDIC and the SEC and the Fed testified at Congress today, we are having our own roundtable. Bill Isaac just said that one of the things we need is to bring back some version of the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banking from investment banking, the solid, safe deposit insurance kind of banking from the riskier, big profit-making activity. I want to flesh that out, but Harvey, I want to get your take first, either on that and or what you think really needs to be done in this regulatory financial question.
I'll try and briefly take a crack at both. I thought what Bill said, and I agree with this, is because I favored the repeal at the time it occurred as well, but I thought what he said was we need a real debate and further consideration in light of recent events. I couldn't agree more with that. I think we do need to consider it, and if for any reason what we have done is problematic, then we need to reverse it. But I think we need to have the kind of intelligent discussion that, unfortunately, we don't get when people pass legislation in a panic. With respect to what we need, I would say we need, there are a lot of things we need, but the three things that I thought were critical and still believe is, first, government regulators have to have access to a continuing stream of significant data about all capital and financial markets. I think that there have been limits on who could regulate what, when, and where. Those limitations have allowed things to fall between the cracks. There has to be, I think, a plain and unequivocal requirement. If you're in the financial or capital markets, you are required to supply data. I think second is that the government has to be under an obligation to analyze that data. Unfortunately, with some agencies, and my beloved SEC is one of them, the data comes in, but there isn't any analysis. The critical thing is for us to have informed markets. So I think there has to be an analysis. And here, one of the things that Bill mentioned earlier is worth repeating. It has to be analyzed by independent agencies. Having the administration do the analysis, whatever administration it is simply not the way to get to accurate understanding of what trends are developing in our markets. Okay. And then the third thing, I think, is there has to be broad power given to a systemic regulator, and I had thought that an independent Fed was the right place to do that. But there has to be broad power given to a systemic regulator that as trends start to appear, that regulator has the ability to stop, look, and listen, to prevent the trends from expanding, to halt them where they are, and then carefully consider what the right approaches are, whether the trends create problems or don't.
Okay. Bill Isaac, again, you expand on your view of what really needs to be done now.
Well, I think Harvey pretty much captured it. I would say that I was strongly in favor of a systemic risk council that would be run by an independent board that would oversee the whole system, what all the regulators were doing, the SEC, the FDIC, the Fed, all of the regulators were doing, what was going on in the marketplace, and would blow the whistle when problems started to develop and would really, I mean, for example, the housing bubble or whatever the issue is. There are accounting rules that created a real problem for us in this cycle, and we need an independent body that's going to look at the whole system on a regular basis, independently, and make some judgments about what risks are developing and what we need to do to stem them. The other thing is we really need to consolidate the bank regulatory agencies. We've got the FDIC, the Office of Controller of the Currency, and the Federal Reserve. They each have different jurisdictions, and they're each doing different things with different kinds of institutions, and an awful lot falls through the cracks. The banking firms naturally play one regulator against the other to try to find the regulator that will allow them to do what they want to do. And we really need to get rid of that system. We need to go to a single agency. It could be the Federal Reserve. It could be the new independent agency that Senator Dodd had advocated and I actually endorsed. But I don't trust any regulatory agency to get it done without oversight. So that's why I feel very strongly that we ought to have an independent FDIC serving as a watchdog over the bank regulators, and I also believe we ought to have a systemic risk council serving as a watchdog over all of the financial regulators, independent agencies that are guessing what's being done. That if we came up with those kinds of reforms, I think we would have a much better financial system. We also need to deal with the issue of too big to fail, and the fact that we have firms out there that are clearly too big to fail. What are we going to do about that? Glass-Steagall has to enter into that debate. We have enormous concentration of economic power and risk in our financial system right now, with the 5 largest firms controlling over half of it. Do we want that? Is it good for America's political health? Is it good for America's economic health? I think not. I think we need to address it in a serious way. But Dodd-Frank doesn't do any of this, of course, and that's why I think Harvey and I both think that it was a wasted opportunity, and now we got to go back and try to get it right.
Gentlemen, thank you so very much. Bill Isaac, former head of the FDIC, chairman of Fifth Third Bancorp, author of Senseless Panic: How Washington Failed America. Harvey Pitt, CEO of Kalorama Partners, former chairman of the SEC.
You can subscribe to Bloomberg's premium podcast service at Bloomberg.com/Tom Keene and listen to the Hays Advantage weekdays at noon Eastern on Bloomberg 1130 in New York or on satellite radio, Sirius Channel 130 and XM Channel 129. Copyright 2011 Bloomberg LP.